Welcome to the Do Not Ignore Your Mortality podcast. Today I have as my guest Marc Seguin. He is the author of the book Advocacy in Aging. And I had picked up this book of his not too long ago and read it, and I found it to be an excellent book. Congratulations on publishing this one, Marc.
Thank you very much. And, back to you. Congratulations. I know what it takes to write a book. And having talked with you before, quickly, I know you've got a lot of passion. So great. And it's great to see that we're somewhat in the same space and we know how important that space is. So thank you very much for having me here today.
Oh, you're welcome, Marc. I'm glad you've taken some time to chat with me here. I think the viewers of this recording will find it beneficial to learn more about your background and what the backstory is of why you were compelled to write this book.
Yeah, unlike you, Greg, who has really some tangible experience in many key industries related to how you plan for the unplanned situations of life and specifically death, my experience is really based on a lot of personal experience over time, and then a slow getting involved in this reality of planning for the unplanned life transition or the aging years. I'll probably highlight four potentially events that come to my mind when I think of that. The first one, basically living with my father-in-law, and he was passionate about planning for his estate and read a lot of books and so on. But in hindsight, he never planned on losing his mind. And he had planned, I can't tell you how much he had planned. But when he started losing his mind, he started undoing some of the good work he had done in the name of simplifying things because his mind couldn't handle it. And he was keeping things to himself. I guess on one hand, he didn't realize that he was losing his mind. And that really worried me, and especially that eventually he got diagnosed with dementia. And we did get involved when there was a big mistake, a big enough mistake made. And that's what we got to intervene. And luckily enough, we were able to reconstruct what he had put in place while he has his mind. But that really opened my eyes, because if you look at the statistics of cognitive incapacity, more and the majority linked to dementia, the statistics are staggering. There's about 750,000 people right now in Canada that are going through dementia. Imagine how many through all the states if it's the same ratio. If you're not prepared before you have dementia and you haven't communicated your wish and so on, it makes a very difficult situation for yourself, but mostly for the family around. So that probably was the first trigger that opened my eyes. And I said, what am I going to do for me to be prepared if that happens to me? The second event was, or second fact, I remember talking to a friend of mine that on a Saturday morning, we were on the ski hill, in fact, and I said, how was your week? And he says, well, it was not as planned. And he explained to me that his father had gone to the hospital and he was not meant to go to the hospital. I said, why? And he says, well, we had a healthcare directive, or some people call it an advanced care directive, not to take him to hospital under these circumstances. And goes through the story. He had to get involved and find out why that occurred, even though they had done all the right things in planning. But what got my attention is I didn't understand what these advanced care planning possibility were. What did it mean to put actually a healthcare directive in place? Honestly, it took me a number of years to wrap my head around that. I knew what a power of attorney was, power of attorney for finance, power of attorney for care, but I didn't know what advanced care planning was, and I didn't know what a healthcare directive. And once I did, I said, that's what everyone needs, and I'm going to start with myself. So that was kind of another area that got my attention. When my parents were the old generation, never talked about money, never talked. They did tell us they had a will. They did told us that I was the co-executor with one of my sisters, and where the will could be found in the fire safe box in the house. But that was about it. And my parents had a wonderful but humbling life, and they were living very well until in mid-80s, they were, living a full life, a high quality of life. And one day they decide to sell their home. And even though I didn't know much about their financial situation, I always worried about if they had enough and whether I needed to subsidize it. But I didn't worry about it that much because I knew their home was paid for, and that was always a buffer. But the day they sold their home, the buffer had gone. And I said, I need to open the conversation because I need to make sure that they're okay. And if we need to help, we need to be there for them. Anyways, it started a whole process of communication and engagement. And, I'm going to call it a bit in catch-up mode, but it was good. And we learned through that process, and I learned a lot of good practices and best practices that inspired me for what I did for myself. And eventually those good practices are part of the content of the book. And I'll say, as a side value of that whole, come together with my parents, was we ended up having a new relationship and a deeper relationship on a different level. And I cherish that forever. And I feel very good today that my dad is still alive, and he's now 97. He turned 97 last week. My mom passed away a year and a half ago with dementia, unfortunately, and but at the age of 91. But I feel very good that through this process, I was able to make decision from their wishes, not what I thought was best and what to do. I really, when I act upon for them, I act upon based on their ways of doing things. So that really inspired me, and clearly I apply for my own family now with communications. And then I know you probably have other questions, but the last pillar was I had a life event where briefly I could tell I was traveling in Spain, and we were victim of a scam where fundamentally we were two couples, but the purses of the ladies and the backpacks of the men got stolen, passport, money, computers, cell phones. So you're left alone in the middle of Spain, and you really have a problem now to resolve. And I was not as much worried about the loss of valuable or money. I was very much, because there was enough information in collectively all the computers and phones and so on, that there was a great risk of identity theft if that was the intent of the people. And I stayed up for 24 hours to try to block what could have been vulnerable. And it took me a greater part of a month to rebuild my estate situation to what it was, and to protect and change passwords and so on and so forth. But what I retain of that is that I was lucky because I had spent quite a bit of time concentrating my affairs. I had organized my affairs. It was top of mind. And through this event, I was alive and well. And I keep asking myself, what if I would have been victim of an accident, or they would attack me and I was in the hospital in a coma? My kids would have had to pick that up. And then I said, oh my goodness. So through that event, I realized that, I've got this concept of 24-hour readiness should something happen. So I expect that my wife and kids, should something happen to me within 24 hours, should be able to operate my affairs the way I do, and run our affairs for our family, and not spend the time trying to figure out where my affairs are, get authorization to access bank accounts, and so on and so forth. So all of that has been part of my mindset. So a combination of, we could lose our mind, events could happen quickly. Healthcare directive are another pillar that everyone have. Good practices from the parents, and being ready for the unplanned. Those are key events. As I planned for myself, I learned a lot of what is easy to be done, and eventually I said, okay, I'd like to share those practices with the greater part of the world, and the world has to shift mindset and plan ahead. These are not taboo subject. In fact, these are things where you want to open communications and rally people around you, so that if something happens, people could take over easily and transition your affairs gracefully in the way that respects your wishes, beliefs, and values.
What a great message, Marc. When I read your book, I was caught up in a number of these stories that you had written about. And now that you've elaborated on them, especially that one about your experience in Spain, it just gets you really thinking about how life can change so quickly. And I've certainly experienced that too. But your message about being prepared and being ready reminds me of when I was a young kid. I was a Boy Scout, and I remember getting a badge for being prepared, and that was part of their whole mission of Boy Scouts. Maybe you remember that sort of thing as a kid as well. But it seems that in this era of retirement planning being so popular and prevalent, this whole issue of being prepared in case we are incapacitated or life changes and we don't have any control anymore, building in those controls can be done effectively if we lean into it when times are good.
Absolutely. And we all read in the paper all kinds of events that happen. And one comes to mind last year. I live in a local little rural village south of Ottawa, and there was an accident on the main street where two women, 60, one of them ended up in a hospital and one of them ended up in basically passed away. And you never prepare for these circumstances, but these could happen. And neither of those situations are great. And then the people around them need to pick up the pieces. And at that moment in time, the people that are living this crisis, it's not in times of crisis that you have your mind clear and that you're able to pick up the pieces, both as a supporter, but even the person in this case that was in the hospital, all of a sudden, well, she may not even have all her abilities to be able to help. But even emotionally, you're not prepared it's not the right time to step back and communicate your wishes and crystallize your values and wishes. All of a sudden you've been victim of a big life event that may change your whole perspective. So we should never act on a whim. We've heard those expressions. So absolutely, this is where you and I certainly come together. The better you plan ahead of time, it's clear. And you could change. We could remind ourselves there's nothing wrong with in life you change, but if you plan ahead of time, you establish a strong basis, and then these are my wishes, and here's my ways of doing things. And along the way, as you communicate with your family and people around you, it's okay to change, or life events may change your views, and that's okay. But you need to plan and revisit your planning on a regular basis. And you probably heard the same thing. You hear too many people that done a will, and when 30 years ago, and yeah. The context around them have changed, right? So it's not valid. So I would say that, and I'm I think everyone has slightly different opinion of how often, but you should revisit at least every 5 years or on a regular basis your will to make sure that it's still applicable. And the same thing would go for power of attorney and all the other planning elements that you put in place.
Yeah, it's really an ongoing process, isn't it? It's not as if we do it once and it's done, because our lives do change, and we have the family expands and our objectives may change, and the rules around these types of documents occasionally change too.
Absolutely. One of the things that that I've actually not written in my book, and for those listening to this, I haven't read Greg's book yet, so I'll be open, but we plan on doing so. It's been a very busy year of unplanned activities in my life, so but it's definitely on top of my to-do list. But one of the things that I realized that a number of authors like Greg and I have talked about, the planning process and the importance of communications. And we base, it's easy to say you need to communicate with your family. It's not an easy process. And I'm in probably year 3 to 4 and having a yearly family meeting with my family. And I've realized through that process 2 things. First of all, it's going to probably take me 10 years to get to the types of communications, the depth and the breadth of communications that I want to get to, so that my family is prepared and we are aligned, and that everyone learns, and not only for me, but for themselves. And that these communications are not easy. So I'm now finding myself challenged every year as we plan for these family meetings, that it's how do we turn it from what is perceived as a negative thought or depressing talk to something fun. So I'm developing for our own family tools to have these family meetings, and some of which I draw from my experience in corporate life, where we, as we had team events and facilitations, I use some of those tools, and I'm working with a few other people on some of the other approach that could be used to make these family meetings a fun thing that people look forward to, as opposed to an obligation because mom and dad want us to have this meeting and talk about this, right? So it's challenging, right? So
it is. That's a great point, Mark. And I find the same thing. I'm challenged with my family to and even just in general, to get a heightened sense of engagement with these types of topics. I've been promoting what I have been calling a mortality mindset movement, which will help survivors be more financially and emotionally resilient. It'll help survivors be more adapted to grief. It'll help family members be more inclined to get along. It'll ultimately help charities do more of their good work, because estate planning quite often involves giving to charities and such. And it'll help take a huge onus off our judicial system, because the courts won't have to deal with so many unorganized estates. But this whole word mortality, and I know that I've used mortality in the title of my book, and I was kind of forced to for intellectual property reasons, but it's a turnoff. It's a word that people tend to avoid, as we keep saying. But I'm starting to think that the phrase "a living legacy" is something a little more palatable and enticing and hopefully appealing, that will help my message get out there a little more with more impact. But I think we should have another podcast at some point soon, Mark. We've got so much that we could be talking about and sharing with our listeners and so on. But I think for today, was there anything else that you wanted to end this session with, Mark?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would love to have another podcast. I certainly welcome it. I think you and I have a lot to share. And I think we share in the spirit of what you said that was very important. You didn't use those exact words, but I've heard them now from multiple people. It's about, leading a change in society, a change where, we do talk about our mortality. We do talk about planning, and planning needs to go beyond just planning for your retirement, and it needs to go beyond money, right? So, and society needs a change. As I said, my parents, in that generation, talk about money was taboo. Talking about your health issues was taboo. It needs to flip the other way. So absolutely. First of all, thank you very much for doing these podcasts. We need to keep getting the message out there, and in a very positive way. You're absolutely correct. It's not negative to talk about. It's reality, and it's reality to allow you to live comfortably, knowing you have peace of mind that you're organized, but also to make sure that the people around you that you care and love are also prepared for these unexpected events, right? So
but ultimately we want to do it for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you for your time today, Mark. I'm going to end the recording, and we will keep chatting here behind the scenes. We'll set up another recording soon.
Perfect. Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome.